The party had been moving for 9 days and they were lost. Not lost in the way that a person is lost when they have taken a wrong turn on a familiar road. Lost in the way that a person is lost when the landscape around them has no feature they recognize, no trail they can follow, no landmark that corresponds to anything on the map they are carrying, and no indication of which direction will lead to safety and which will lead deeper into terrain that is already killing them. There were 14 men. They had left Sacramento in the spring of 1850, part of the flood of prospectors moving into the Sierra Nevada in the aftermath of the gold discovery at Sutter's Mill. They were not inexperienced travelers. Several had crossed the plains. 2 had military backgrounds. Their leader, a man named Robert Carver, had been through the Appalachians multiple times and considered himself a capable navigator in mountain terrain. The Sierra Nevada was not the Appalachians. The range that runs along the eastern spine of California is not simply larger than the Appalachians. It is fundamentally different in character, steeper, more abrupt, more given to the kind of terrain that appears passable from a distance and reveals its impossibility only when you are already committed to it. The snowpack in the high elevations in spring of 1850 was heavy. Trails that other parties had used earlier in the season had been buried or rendered impassable by late storms. The party had deviated from their planned route to avoid a section that looked dangerous from below and had not found their way back to it. By the 9th day, 2 men had frostbite in their feet. The food supply had 4 days left at reduced rations. Carver's map, which had been produced from survey data that turned out to be inaccurate for the specific section of the range they were in, showed a pass approximately 6 miles to the northeast that the party had been moving toward for 3 days without finding. The pass did not appear to exist. On the morning of the 10th day, the party encountered a small group of Miwok people moving through the same terrain. The meeting was tense. Encounters between prospectors and native people in California in 1850 were rarely uncomplicated, for reasons that did not favor the native people. But the situation was desperate enough that Carver made the decision to ask for help. Through gestures and the limited Spanish that one of the Miwok men spoke and one of Carver's party understood, the situation was communicated. The Miwok guide, a man whose name Carver recorded phonetically as something he later approximated as Tomas, listened, looked at the terrain around them for a long moment, and then pointed in a direction that was southwest. Not northeast, where the map showed the pass. Southwest. Carver did not believe him. He argued, through the interpreter, that the map showed the pass to the northeast. The Miwok guide listened to this, looked at the map briefly, and then said, through the interpreter, words that Carver recorded in his journal that evening as approximately, "The map is wrong about this place." They followed the guide southwest. 4 hours later they were through the mountains. If this is the kind of story that stops you, knowledge so precise it made a map look like a guess, make sure you are subscribed. This channel exists for exactly this history and there is much more coming. To understand why the miners found native mountain navigation so shocking, you need to understand what they believed about mountains, and what tools they trusted to move through them. The prospectors who flooded into the Sierra Nevada in 1849 and 1850 came predominantly from the eastern United States and from Europe. Their experience of mountain terrain was varied but shared a common characteristic. The mountains they knew were mappable in ways that had proven reliable. The Appalachians had been surveyed. The passes through the Alps were documented. The mountain crossings that mattered to European and Eastern American travelers had been traveled enough times by enough surveyors that the maps available for those ranges were accurate enough to be trusted. They transferred this trust to maps of the Sierra Nevada. This was a reasonable assumption and a dangerous one. The Sierra Nevada had not been surveyed with anything approaching the detail that eastern ranges had received. The maps available to California-bound travelers in 1850 were compiled from partial surveys, from the accounts of earlier travelers who had crossed the range at specific points, and from geographic inference based on observed features. For the major established routes, the Carson Pass, the Truckee Pass that would later be named Donner Pass, the maps were adequate. For the broader range they were not. The mountains themselves compounded the problem. The Sierra Nevada is a range where the relationship between what you can see and what you can reach is consistently misleading. A ridge that appears to offer a passage from below often terminates in a cliff face that was invisible from the approach. A canyon that appears to lead through the range curves and narrows into an impassable choke point miles from where the passage appeared to begin. Snow in spring obscures terrain features that would be readable in summer, covering the rock formations and vegetation patterns that experienced travelers used to assess route viability. The miners carried compasses, maps, and the navigational knowledge of people trained in environments where those tools were sufficient. In the Sierra Nevada in spring, those tools were frequently not sufficient. The compass told you north. It did not tell you whether north led to a passable ridge or a 2,000-foot drop. The map showed features that the survey had captured. It did not show the features the survey had missed, which in the Sierra Nevada in 1850 were numerous and often the most critical ones. The native guides who led parties through these mountains were operating with a completely different navigational system, one that did not depend on maps or compasses and that had been built specifically for the terrain, the season, and the conditions that the miners were failing to navigate. Understanding why that system worked so much better requires understanding what it was actually made of. The mountain knowledge of the Miwok, Shoshone, Paiute, and other native nations of the Sierra Nevada and the broader Mountain West was not a collection of memorized routes. It was something more comprehensive and more flexible than that. A deep literacy in the language of mountain terrain that allowed experienced guides to read landscapes they had never personally traveled and identify viable routes through them. This distinction matters. A memorized route is a brittle form of knowledge. It works when conditions match the conditions under which the route was learned and fails when conditions diverge. Snow that buries a summer trail does not simply hide a memorized route. It transforms the terrain into something different, where the memorized features are gone and the navigation must begin again from the landscape as it currently exists. The guides who moved miners through the Sierra Nevada in winter and spring conditions were not simply following remembered paths. They were reading the current landscape, its slopes, its exposures, its vegetation patterns, its snow characteristics, its drainage patterns, and deriving from that reading an understanding of where passage was possible and where it was not. The first layer of this reading was slope and exposure. A south-facing slope in the Sierra Nevada loses snow faster than a north-facing slope because it receives more direct sunlight. By late spring, south-facing slopes at moderate elevations were often clear of snow while north-facing slopes at the same elevation remained buried. A guide who understood this pattern could read the snow coverage on the slopes visible from any given position and derive from that reading information about the current passability of routes that used those slopes. Information that was not on any map because it changed with every week of the season. The second layer was vegetation. Tree species in mountain terrain are not distributed randomly. They follow elevation bands, moisture gradients, and exposure patterns that are consistent enough to serve as navigational references. The transition from ponderosa pine to lodgepole pine in the Sierra Nevada occurs at a specific elevation band that is visible from a distance. The presence of specific shrub communities indicates specific soil and moisture conditions that correspond to specific terrain characteristics. A guide who could read vegetation was reading terrain information that was encoded in the landscape itself rather than on a map, and that was accurate in a way that maps of the Sierra Nevada in 1850 were not. The third layer was water. Water in mountain terrain follows gravity in ways that are consistent and readable. The drainage patterns visible on a mountain slope, where water runs, where it collects, where it disappears underground, describe the terrain structure in ways that are often more informative than the visible surface topography. A guide who understood how water moved through a specific mountain system could use drainage patterns to reconstruct the terrain's three-dimensional structure from a two-dimensional view and identify where the passes were, the high points and ridgelines where drainage divides created the low spots that allowed crossing. The miners had maps. The guides had the mountain itself, read in a language that the mountain had been writing long before any surveyor arrived to transcribe it imperfectly onto paper. The physical capacity of native mountain guides was not incidental to their effectiveness. It was a core component of the system, developed through the same long process of deliberate training and accumulated experience that produced their geographical knowledge. Mountain travel at altitude in the Sierra Nevada makes demands on the human body that are different in kind from the demands of travel at lower elevations. The air at 8,000 feet contains roughly 25% less oxygen than at sea level. Sustained physical effort at that elevation, climbing steep terrain, carrying weight, moving quickly to cover distance before weather changes, produces oxygen debt faster and recovers from it more slowly than the same effort at lower elevation. A person not adapted to altitude reaches the limits of their aerobic capacity sooner, recovers more slowly, and makes poorer decisions under the cognitive impairment that altitude-induced oxygen deprivation produces. The guides who led mining parties through the Sierra Nevada had grown up at altitude. Many of the native communities of the eastern Sierra slopes spent significant portions of the year at elevations above 6,000 feet and made regular crossings of the high range. The physiological adaptations that result from living and working at altitude over years, increased red blood cell density, more efficient oxygen extraction, greater capillary density in working muscles, were present in these guides in ways that they were not present in miners arriving from sea-level eastern cities. The practical consequence was that a native guide moving through high Sierra terrain was operating comfortably at an aerobic level that was pushing the miners in his party close to their limits. He had energy available for observation, for reading the terrain, assessing conditions, making navigation decisions, that the miners were spending simply on the physical act of moving forward. The guide was thinking clearly at 10,000 feet. Some of the men he was leading were not. The guides also moved differently in mountain terrain in ways that reduced energy expenditure and injury risks simultaneously. The specific footwork required for stable movement on steep, irregular, snow-covered terrain, the weight distribution, the pace adjustments, the route finding within a route that minimizes exposure to the most dangerous microterrain, was knowledge carried in the body rather than the mind, acquired through years of mountain travel beginning in childhood. Miners who were physically strong and experienced travelers in lower terrain moved through the high Sierra with a labored, energy-intensive technique that left them exhausted and vulnerable to the falls and sprains that irregular mountain terrain produces in people whose bodies have not learned to read it step by step. The guide's efficiency in the mountains was not simply a matter of knowing where to go. It was a matter of having a body that had been trained to go there, that moved through the terrain the way a body moves through familiar space, with the automatic energy-conserving competence that only long experience produces. The Sierra Nevada is one of the most meteorologically dynamic mountain ranges in North America. Weather systems moving in from the Pacific Ocean encounter the range and produce conditions that can change from clear and cold to blizzard in hours, at any time of year, with a speed and violence that has killed experienced mountaineers who were caught without shelter or route options. For the miners moving through the range in the gold rush years, weather was the factor most likely to turn a difficult mountain crossing into a fatal one. The Donner Party disaster of 1846, still vivid in the memory of anyone attempting a Sierra crossing in 1850, was fundamentally a weather disaster. The party had been delayed and was moving through the high passes in conditions that deteriorated faster than they could respond to. Native guides in the Sierra Nevada and the surrounding ranges possessed weather reading capabilities that the miners consistently described as remarkable. The ability to anticipate significant weather changes hours or in some cases a day before those changes became apparent to anyone without the guide's specific observational framework. This was not mystical. It was the integration of multiple environmental signals that individually were ambiguous but together constituted a reliable forecast. Cloud formation and movement was the most visible layer. The specific patterns of cloud development over the Sierra crest, the way lenticular clouds formed over high peaks in advance of approaching systems, the direction and speed of high-altitude cirrus movement, the way cumulus development accelerated or stabilized in the afternoon heat, were readable by people who had observed them consistently over years in that specific range. Each pattern had a history of outcomes attached to it in the observer's experience, and the patterns that reliably preceded dangerous weather had been distinguished, through that experience, from the patterns that looked similar but did not produce the same outcomes. Wind behavior in mountain terrain is complex because terrain shapes wind in ways that produce local patterns that diverge significantly from the prevailing conditions. A guide who knew how wind moved through specific canyon systems and over specific passes in the approach to a major weather system could read the current wind behavior and derive from it information about what was coming, information that was not available to someone without the local knowledge required to interpret what the wind was doing and why. Animal behavior provided a third layer. The behavioral responses of wildlife to approaching severe weather, the movements of specific bird species, the behavior of deer and other ungulates, the activity patterns of ground squirrels and marmots in the alpine zone, were observable and had been observed over enough seasons to be reliable indicators. A guide who noticed specific combinations of animal behavior knew what those combinations had preceded in past experience and adjusted his route planning accordingly. The miners saw the guides make predictions that proved accurate and attributed them to intuition or to some vague cultural connection to nature. What they were witnessing was applied meteorology, systematic, experience-based, specific to the range and the season. that operated without instruments but produced results that instruments would not have significantly improved. The physical passes through the Sierra Nevada, the low points in the ridgeline where the range could be crossed without technical climbing, were not evenly distributed or obvious from below. The range's geology had produced a landscape where passes occurred in patterns that bore no simple relationship to the overall terrain visible from the western approach. Some of the most useful passes were hidden behind ridgelines that appeared, from below, to offer no crossing at all. Others were visible but approached through terrain that seemed to block access until a specific route, known to the guides but not apparent to anyone without that knowledge, revealed the way through. The Miwok guide who led Robert Carver's party southwest rather than northeast was not contradicting the map arbitrarily. He was directing the party toward a pass that was not on the map, a crossing that the survey that produced the map had not documented, that was invisible from the most common approach routes, and that was known to the Miwok because it had been used by Miwok travelers crossing the range for generations. These undocumented passes were among the most valuable pieces of geographical knowledge the guides possessed, and they were knowledge of a kind that no survey conducted from outside the native knowledge system could quickly or reliably replicate. A surveyor crossing the Sierra Nevada along established routes documented what those routes revealed. He could not document passes that were only findable by people who already knew they existed and knew the specific approach that made them accessible. The guides knew these passes because they had used them, and because the knowledge of their existence and approach had been transmitted through the community over generations in the same way that all critical geographical knowledge was transmitted. A pass that provided a safer or faster crossing of the range in spring conditions was information of survival value to the communities that needed to cross the range seasonally, and information of survival value was preserved and transmitted with care. Several of the passes through the Sierra Nevada that were eventually incorporated into routes used by mining and later railroad operations were first brought to the attention of American surveyors by native guides who were leading parties through terrain the surveyors had assessed as impassable. The surveys then confirmed what the guides had known, that a pass existed, that it was accessible under the right conditions by the right approach, and that the earlier assessment of impassability had been made by people who did not know where to look. The map that Carver was carrying showed the mountain's surface. The guide knew its interior, the hidden logic of where the range could be crossed and where it could not, derived from a relationship with that specific landscape over a timescale that made the map look like what it was. A partial and imperfect transcription of a text that the guides had been reading in its original language for generations. If this history is resonating with you, the passes no map showed, the knowledge hidden in plain sight, drop a comment below. Tell me which part surprised you most. I read every single one, and your responses shape what this channel covers next. In the late spring of 1852, a mining party of 22 men attempting to cross the Sierra Nevada via the Carson Pass route encountered conditions that their lead scout described, in a letter written 2 weeks later, as the worst he had seen in 3 years of Sierra crossings. Late-season snowfall had buried the upper section of the route under several feet of new snow. The trail markers that other parties had left earlier in the season were gone. The terrain at the upper elevation was a featureless white expanse in which the actual pass, the specific low point in the ridgeline that was the crossing, was visually indistinguishable from the surrounding snowfield. 2 men had already turned back with frostbite. The remaining 20 were sitting at a camp below the snowline trying to make a decision that none of them felt equipped to make. A Washoe guide named in the letter only as a man who knew this range was brought to the camp by a member of the party who had worked with him the previous season. The guide arrived, assessed the situation, and spent approximately an hour doing something that the letter's author described as walking back and forth along a ridgeline to the east of the camp, looking at the snowfield above in a way that the observer could not interpret. He was reading the snow. The surface of a deep snowfield encodes information about the terrain beneath it for someone who knows how to read the surface. Where the snow is deeper, the surface is higher relative to underlying terrain, but the degree of that relationship varies with wind patterns, sun exposure, and underlying topography in ways that are readable from surface texture, color, and the subtle relief patterns visible in certain light conditions. A guide who knew the underlying terrain and had observed how snow accumulated on it in different conditions could read the current snow surface and reconstruct, with sufficient accuracy for navigation, the terrain beneath it. The guide also read the drainage patterns visible at the snow's edge, where meltwater was running and in what volume, and the wind-formed features of the snow surface itself, which encoded information about the prevailing wind direction during the storm that had deposited it, A direction that corresponded to known weather patterns in ways that carried information about which side of the ridgeline had received the deepest accumulation and where the actual pass was most likely to be. After his hour of observation, he led the party up onto the snowfield on a diagonal route that none of the miners would have chosen, moving steadily and without hesitation through terrain that appeared identical in every direction. After 2.5 hours of uphill travel, the group reached a point where the ridgeline dropped away on the eastern side and the Carson Valley was visible below. They had found the pass. Not where it appeared to be from below. Where it actually was, under the snow, in terrain that the guide had read from its surface while the miners had seen only white. The letter's author wrote, "He walked through that mountain the way I walk through my own house." He knew where everything was before he could see it. The individual guide who led a mining party through an impossible crossing was not operating alone. He was the visible point of contact between the mining party and a much larger system, a community knowledge network that had been building, maintaining, and transmitting mountain knowledge across the Sierra Nevada and surrounding ranges for generations. This network had no physical infrastructure. It had no written records. It existed entirely in the knowledge held by individuals within the communities it connected, and it was maintained through the same mechanisms that sustained all critical knowledge in oral cultures. Deliberate transmission from experienced to inexperienced, structured by relationships and roles that made certain individuals responsible for certain bodies of knowledge, and continuously updated by the ongoing experience of community members traveling through the territory the network covered. Specific individuals within Miwok, Washoe, Paiute, and Shoshone communities held recognized expertise in specific sections of the mountain terrain. The knowledge of seasonal route conditions in the high passes, which routes were safe in early spring, which became passable as snow melted, which were dangerous regardless of season because of rockfall or unstable snowpack, was maintained by people whose community role included the stewardship of this knowledge and its transmission to the next generation of travelers. This specialization meant that when a guide was asked about terrain he had not personally traveled recently, he had access to knowledge from others in the network who had. A Washoe guide asked about conditions on a route he had not traveled that spring could speak with the knowledge of community members who had, because that information had been shared within the community the way all critical information was shared, deliberately, specifically, and with enough detail to be actionable. The miners encountered individual guides and experienced individual knowledge. They did not see the network behind the individual, the community knowledge system that had produced the guide's expertise and that sustained it through the ongoing exchange of current conditions information across the territory. This network was why guides could speak confidently about current conditions and terrain they had not personally traveled for months. It was why the knowledge was resilient. The death of any single guide was a loss but not a catastrophic one, because the knowledge he held was not entirely unique to him. It was distributed across the community, with enough redundancy that critical knowledge survived the loss of individuals. The miners had individual expertise. The guides had community expertise. The difference in the depth and resilience of the knowledge those two structures produced was part of why the guides consistently knew things that no individual miner, however experienced, could have known through personal experience alone. The specific observational vocabulary that native mountain guides used to navigate the Sierra Nevada and surrounding ranges can be partially reconstructed from historical accounts, from the ethnographic records of observers who spent time with these communities, and from the knowledge that survived within those communities into the period when it could be documented more systematically. What emerges from this reconstruction is a picture of navigation built from simultaneous reading of multiple environmental layers, each layer providing information that the others confirmed, contradicted, or refined, until the combined reading converged on a route assessment precise enough to act on. Rock type and formation was one layer. The geology of the Sierra Nevada is not uniform. Different rock types weather differently, produce different slope characteristics, hold snow differently, and drain water differently. A guide who knew the geology of a section of the range could predict, from the rock formations visible at a distance, what the terrain would be like on arrival, whether a slope that looked climbable would be stable or crumbling, whether a cliff face that appeared to block a route had a ledge system that allowed passage, whether a boulder field was movable or locked by ice beneath the surface. Snow characteristics beyond surface appearance provided a second layer. The sound of footsteps on snow encodes information about snow density and stability. Experienced mountain travelers can assess avalanche risk from the sound and feel of their steps in ways that are not reducible to visual observation alone. The temperature gradient within a snowpack, accessible by probing with a pole or a hand, indicates whether the snow is stable or has the weak layers that produce slab avalanche conditions. The guides who crossed the High Sierra in spring were reading snow stability continuously, routing parties through terrain where conditions were safe and away from terrain where they were not, often without any explanation that the miners could recognize as risk assessment. Animal tracks in snow provided a third layer. The routes that wildlife used to cross the high range were not random. They followed the terrain's easiest lines, the routes that minimized elevation gain and exposure, the crossings that were most reliable across a range of conditions. A guide who could read wildlife movement patterns in the snow was reading the mountain's own recommendation for where to go, a recommendation produced by the accumulated trial and error of countless animals over countless seasons, with the failed routes eliminated and the viable ones reinforced by continued use. The integration of these layers, geology, snow, weather, drainage, vegetation, wildlife movement, into a simultaneous, continuous environmental reading produced route assessments that appeared, to the miners watching the guides, like something beyond ordinary human perception. It was not beyond ordinary human perception. It was the full deployment of ordinary human perception, trained over years to attend to specific signals in a specific environment, producing a kind of awareness that was entirely available to human senses but that required years of specific experience to develop. The historical record of native mountain guide knowledge in the Sierra Nevada and the surrounding ranges is richer than might be expected, because several of the military officers and civilian surveyors who worked in the region in the 1850s and 1860s were careful enough observers to document what they witnessed with enough specificity to be useful. John Charles Fremont, whose survey expeditions through the Mountain West in the 1840s produced some of the most detailed early geographical knowledge of the region, was explicit in his published accounts about the dependence of his surveys on native guides. Kit Carson, who served as Fremont's guide on multiple expeditions and whose own knowledge was partly derived from his relationships with native guides, described the mountain knowledge of specific Shoshone and Paiute guides in terms that left no ambiguity about his assessment of its sophistication. Richard Stoddard Ewell, an Army officer who served in the Southwest in the 1850s and whose journals contain detailed observations of the people he encountered, documented the mountain navigation of Apache guides in the ranges of the Southern Territory with a precision that modern geographers have found accurate enough to identify specific passes and routes he was describing. Ewell was honest about the limits of his own understanding. He could observe that the guides knew where they were going and document the outcomes of their navigation, but he could not always reconstruct the process by which they arrived at their route decisions. What these accounts share is a consistent pattern. Experienced, trained, confident men who had navigated difficult terrain in multiple environments finding themselves in a position of genuine dependence on native guides in mountain terrain, acknowledging that dependence honestly, and struggling to explain within their available framework how the guides possessed the knowledge they so clearly possessed. The explanations they reached for were telling. Intuition appeared frequently, the sense that the guides were operating on something below conscious reasoning. Natural affinity appeared, the idea that certain people had an innate connection to wild terrain. These explanations were wrong in the sense that they misidentified the source of the knowledge, but they were honest responses to something genuinely remarkable. The guides did move through mountain terrain with a fluency that looked, from outside the knowledge system that produced it, like something that transcended ordinary human capability. It did not transcend it. It represented its full development in a specific direction. The capacity to read a mountain landscape at that level of depth and precision is available to human beings. It simply requires a specific kind of investment over a specific time scale that the culture producing the observers had not made and could not quickly replicate. The gold rush years were catastrophic for the native nations of California and the surrounding mountain regions in ways that went far beyond the violence and displacement of the immediate period. They were also catastrophic for the bodies of knowledge that those nations had developed and maintained over generations. Knowledge that, once the communities that held it were destroyed or dispersed, could not be simply recovered or reconstructed. The Miwok population of the Sierra Nevada foothills dropped by an estimated 75 to 80% in the decade following the gold discovery. The causes were multiple: disease, violence, displacement from food-producing territories, and the collapse of the social structures that sustained community life. The knowledge that those communities had held, the mountain routes, the seasonal passage conditions, the geological and ecological reading systems, The accumulated understanding of how the Sierra Nevada worked as a navigable landscape was held in those communities. When the communities collapsed, the knowledge collapsed with them. This was not gradual degradation. It was rapid, catastrophic loss. Knowledge that had been built over generations was gone within a decade, not because it was fragile but because the conditions required to sustain it, stable communities, experienced elders with time and relationships to transmit knowledge to the next generation, young people living in the landscape long enough to develop the observational experience the knowledge required, were destroyed faster than the knowledge could be transmitted. Some knowledge survived. Specific individuals carried portions of it through the catastrophic years and into the period when ethnographers began attempting to document what remained. Some communities maintained enough continuity to preserve fragments of the mountain knowledge system. But the comprehensive, integrated, community-held system that had allowed guides like Tomas and the unnamed Washoe guide to lead mining parties through terrain that no map could navigate, that system in its full form did not survive. What was lost was not simply route knowledge, not a set of facts that could have been written down and preserved in a library. What was lost was a way of reading a landscape that required years of immersive experience to develop, held in a community structure that no archive could replicate. The mountain passes the guides knew are still there. The knowledge of how to find them in spring snow conditions, how to read the weather coming over the crest 3 hours before it arrived, how to interpret the subtle surface features of a snowfield to locate the terrain beneath. That knowledge is largely gone, and its absence is a loss that no amount of modern technology has fully remedied. Robert Carver, the mining party leader who had followed the Miwok guide southwest rather than northeast on that spring morning in 1850, eventually made it to the goldfields and spent 2 seasons prospecting in the Sierra Nevada foothills. He did not find the fortune he had come for. He returned to the east in 1852 and took up a career in land surveying, a profession he had trained for before the gold fever had pulled him west. In his new career, Carver worked on surveys of mountain terrain in the eastern ranges, the Appalachians, the Green Mountains, the ranges of western Pennsylvania and Virginia. He was good at it. He had an eye for terrain that his Sierra Nevada experience had sharpened, and his colleagues respected his ability to read landscape features that other surveyors missed. But in the memoir he wrote in the last years of his life, a short document, privately printed, given to family members and a few professional colleagues, he returned to the morning of the Miwok guide. To standing in the snow with his map open, pointing northeast at a pass that was not there. To the guide's brief examination of the map and the words that came back through the interpreter. The map is wrong about this place. He wrote that the moment had stayed with him for more than 30 years because it had contained a lesson he had spent those 30 years trying to fully understand. The lesson was not that maps were useless. He had spent his career making maps and he believed in their value. The lesson was about what maps could and could not contain, about the difference between a representation of a landscape and a knowledge of it. The map was a transcription. It captured what the surveyor had seen from the positions he had occupied, at the time he had observed it, under the conditions that prevailed during his survey. It was accurate within those limits and inaccurate beyond them. It could not capture what you learned by moving through the landscape in all seasons, over many years, attending to everything the landscape communicated about itself to a person who had learned its language. The guide had that language. The map did not. Carver wrote, "He looked at my map the way I might look at a child's drawing of a house I have lived in for 40 years. It was not wrong about everything. It was incomplete in the ways that mattered most, in the moment that mattered most, and he knew it before he had looked at it for more than a few seconds, because he already knew the mountain, and the map had told him everything it knew, and what it knew was less than what he had known before he looked." If something in this story stayed with you, the guide who pointed southwest when the map said northeast, the snow that was read like a text, the passes that no survey had documented, or the surveyor who spent 30 years understanding what a map cannot contain, leave it below. Because the distance between a representation of a place and a knowledge of it is one of the most important distances a person can understand. And this history is worth every mile of it.